The void of space stretched endlessly before him, a black nothingness dotted with cold, distant stars. Lorik, a veteran of countless campaigns, floated among the twisted wreckage of a battlecruiser, his armor scorched and dented from the recent assault. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the faint crackle of his Vox unit and the distant groans of dying machines. Here, in the unfeeling darkness, there were no orders, no banners, no glory, only the weight of survival. Every shadow seemed to breathe. Every flicker of light hinted at horrors unseen. He had fought armies, daemons, and traitors alike, yet nothing could prepare him for the emptiness of this moment. It was a calm that screamed louder than any gunfire. The truth of his existence, the price of service to the Emperor, pressed down on him like the gravitic pull of a collapsing star. Memories intruded unbidden, fragments of a life long erased by ritual and gene seed augmentation. Faces of comrades lost to the battlefield, twisted by mutation or slaughtered by their own orders, appeared in fleeting glimpses between the floating wreckage. The screams of the recently departed seemed to echo inside his own skull, whispers of the dead weaving through the emptiness. Space Marines were taught to suppress such thoughts, to embrace duty over emotion, but some echoes were too persistent to ignore. His hands tightened around the bolter, though it was useless here, drifting in the wrecked corridor of the cruiser's shattered hull. The cold metal of his armor was a cruel reminder that he had traded flesh for protection, empathy for survival, and that even in this isolation, he could not escape the weight of his humanity, or what remained of it. Lorik's visor flickered as a distant light pierced the void, an unnatural glow that shifted like a living thing. It wasn't the glow of the sun, nor the reflection of distant worlds. Something else, something alien and malignant, stirred within the wreckage. He knew the legends whispered among recruits and initiates, the tales of ships lost to the warp, of Marines driven mad by the psychic resonance of unseen entities. And now, faced with the first signs of their presence, a chill deeper than the cold of space gripped his spine. Fear was a weapon the chapter sought to remove, yet here, alone, it surged like a tidal wave. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to abandon honor and duty, but there was nowhere to go. Only the silence, the endless void, and the unseen horrors that lurked just beyond perception. As he drifted, powerless and exposed, the realization settled into his bones. No glory awaited him in this place. No triumph of battle or praise of the Emperor. Only endless suffering, the quiet, omnipresent horror of the Imperium's machinery of war. And somewhere, far beyond his damaged Voxlink, the galaxy carried on oblivious to his plight. Ships plunged into warp storms, worlds burned, and the screams of millions went unheard. Yet, here he was, a single armored figure in a universe that neither noticed nor cared. Lorik tightened his gauntleted hands around his bolter, preparing for threats he could barely comprehend, knowing that this was only the beginning. The untold horror of being a space marine was not the battles or the bloodshed. It was the solitude, the weight of duty pressing relentlessly against the mind, the whispers of a humanity that had long since been sacrificed to the Emperor's will. Life as a space marine was never meant to be comfortable. From the moment a boy was taken, the chapter claimed him, reshaping his body, mind, and soul to serve the Emperor without question. Lorik remembered the first days of induction, the endless drills, the searing pain of gene seed implantation, the ritualistic scarring, and the nightly examinations that tore him apart more than any enemy could. Flesh was rewritten, muscles reinforced, bones grafted and hardened. Yet even the physical transformation was only the beginning. Sleep became a distant memory, emotions were rationed, and fear was systematically eradicated. In its place, the relentless drum of obedience beat ceaselessly, echoing through mind and body alike. Those who failed, who flinched, or who hesitated were quietly removed, their absence a lesson in the cost of weakness. The halls of the chapter fortress were alive with their own oppressive rhythm. Metal clanged as initiates practiced with weapons far heavier than they should have been able to lift. The air was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and something else, darker, fear, despair, the residue of countless deaths. Every corner held reminders of the cost of failure, shrines to fallen brothers, racks of decommissioned armor, and murals depicting campaigns where only the victorious remained. Lorik walked these corridors countless times, each echo of his boots a reminder that he was never alone and never safe. Even in silence, the shadows whispered the expectations of the Emperor. Here, compassion was weakness, doubt was death, and every action was scrutinized by the ghosts of those who had come before. Training was more than physical. It was a mental crucible. The mind was sharpened, fortified, and broken in equal measure. Memory augmentation allowed the warrior to recall decades of combat experience that he had never lived. Yet each recollection carried a shadow of pain and loss. The pain of comrades fallen in distant battles, the anguish of worlds consumed by fire, and the screams of the dying became imprinted upon every neuron. The Emperor demanded perfection, and imperfection was not tolerated. Lorik remembered the nights spent in sensory deprivation chambers, forced to confront visions of his own mortality, hallucinations of friends begging for salvation, and whispers from the warp promising madness. Few emerged unscathed, and those who did were left hollowed, their humanity buried beneath layers of gene seed and armor. And yet, amidst the brutality, there was purpose. Each patrol, each mission, each slaughter was framed as service to the Emperor, a cosmic order that demanded sacrifice. Yet the cost was constant, inescapable, and intimate. The loss of laughter, love, and the simple comfort of human touch. Lorik often wondered if he had ever truly been human, or if he was now a vessel for the chapter's will. Even as he struck down enemies on countless battlefields, the echoes of what he had lost reverberated in the quiet moments between campaigns. Sleep was for the dead, and rest for the foolish. Every day brought a new reminder that being a space marine was not honor or glory. It was a relentless, unending trial of body, mind, and soul. In the Imperium, life was brief, brutal, and sacred, only to those willing to sacrifice everything, even themselves, in the Emperor's name. The mission began under a crimson sky, the planet below, scarred with cratered cities and rivers of ash. Lorik's squad descended into the ruined streets, boots clanging against twisted metal and cracked stone. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and a faint, acrid tang that burned the lungs. Silence reigned at first, but it was the kind of silence that promised violence, the quiet before a storm, pregnant with expectation. Every corner seemed to move. Every shadow shifted with intent. Loric's visor scanned constantly, his reflexes taut as steel wires. This was no ordinary world. Intelligence had reported warp disturbances, and the stories of entire patrols disappearing without a trace haunted the back of every Marine's mind. The tension was palpable, a living thing that seeped into muscle and bone, warning them that death was already stalking them. It began as whispers, screams too distant to localize, yet human enough to chill the heart. The first attack struck from above, mutated abhumans descending with unnatural speed, their eyes burning with a feral hunger. Bolter fire erupted in deafening blasts, shaking buildings and scorching the air. Loric moved with precision, each shot ending a life in milliseconds. Yet even as bodies fell, more came, seemingly endless, driven by some warp-touched madness. The cries of the dying mixed with the mechanical groans of collapsing structures, creating a cacophony that battered nerves and sanity alike. For every enemy he felled, the air seemed to thicken with a sense of inevitability. This was not a battle he could win, only survival, and even that was uncertain. As the squad pressed forward, the warp began to seep into reality. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, twisting into shapes that screamed and lunged before vanishing. Loric's helmet sensors flickered with warnings, though nothing physical approached. Yet the feeling of being watched, hunted, and dissected by something beyond comprehension was undeniable. Comrades faltered, some screaming at hallucinations only they could see. One, barely recognizable under mutation and stress, lashed out at friend and foe alike before disappearing into a collapsing building. Loric had to execute him with a heavy heart, knowing that hesitation could doom the rest. Each death, each twisted form, deepened the sense of helplessness, of horror, and yet the mission could not be abandoned. By the time they reached the heart of the city, the full extent of the corruption was revealed. Entire districts abandoned to chaos, buildings writhing with living metal, the cries of the damned echoing through alleys that twisted as if alive. Loric's squad fought desperately, every bolt round and chainsword swing a small defiance against inevitability. Yet the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Impossible creatures, warped by the touch of the warp, attacked with unnatural cunning. As the battle reached a crescendo, Loric glimpsed the first signs of what lay behind the disturbances. A daemon, half seen, its presence bending the very air around it. The realization hit with icy certainty. This was not just a battle. It was a prelude to madness, a trial designed to test mind, body, and soul. And the true horrors of being a space marine had only just begun. Before Loric was a space marine, he was something entirely different. A boy with dreams, laughter, and a fragile sense of self. His memories of home were like shards of glass in his mind, sharp and bright, yet painfully distant. Fields of green under alien suns, the warmth of a mother's hand, the faint smell of rain on soil. These had been ripped away with surgical precision the moment the chapter claimed him. The process of becoming a space marine erased more than childhood. It erased identity. Genes were rewritten, bones reforged, and the mind conditioned to serve a purpose far greater than personal desire. Every lesson in obedience was drilled into him with pain that went beyond physical torment, and every night he drifted into a liminal state where memories of his past bled into the rituals of his new existence, a ghostly reminder of the humanity he had lost. The transformation was brutal. Muscle, sinew, and bone were altered in procedures that could crush an ordinary human. Gene seed imbuement reshaped him at a molecular level, replacing weaknesses with engineered perfection. Yet each change carried an echo of suffering. Pain became routine. He learned to walk through agony as if it were air. Sleep, once a sanctuary, was now a vulnerability. And alongside the physical metamorphosis came the mental conditioning. Fear, doubt, and empathy were systematically stripped, replaced with unwavering loyalty to the Emperor and the chapter. Lorik remembered the first time he looked into a mirror after the process. The face staring back was not his own, yet it was both him and not him. Horror mixed with awe as he realized the cost of perfection. Survival at the expense of the soul. Yet even amidst the training, echoes of what he had been refused him no peace. Dreams of friends and family, of laughter and love, haunted the edges of his mind. Every memory was a blade, cutting sharper than any bolter or chainsword. He recalled the friends who had been taken alongside him, their faces twisted in fear as they succumbed to the procedure, their screams echoing in sterile chambers. Some resisted, but resistance only brought death, a reminder of the Emperor's uncompromising will. Lorik survived, but the psychological toll was immeasurable. Every choice, every action, reminded him that his humanity was gone, buried beneath layers of armor, gene seed, and duty. He was a weapon forged by pain, but he still remembered the softness he would never feel again. The weight of these memories never left him. Even in battle, the fleeting thoughts of what he had lost pierced through the steel of his mind. Love, friendship, laughter, concepts that were meaningless to many of his brothers, still flickered like dying candles in the corners of his psyche. Every drop of blood spilled, every life taken, was both service to the Emperor and a reminder of what he could no longer reclaim. Lorik carried the burden of all that was sacrificed, and it shaped the man he had become, ruthless in combat, precise in thought, yet haunted by echoes of a life that might have been. In the Imperium, a space marine was a paragon of strength, but beneath the armor and gene seed lay a creature of sorrow, horror, and suspended humanity, forever haunted by memories of what had been sacrificed to ensure survival. The planet before them was a nightmare made flesh, a world that had long since surrendered to the touch of chaos. Its cities were nothing more than skeletal ruins, blackened by fire and etched with arcane symbols that throbbed like a living heartbeat. The air itself was thick with a miasma that clawed at the mind, tinged with the screams of the dead and the whispers of those who had never lived. Lorik and his squad moved with cautious precision, their senses straining against the unnatural distortions that plagued the environment. Shadows stretched unnaturally, buildings seemed to pulse subtly, and even the faintest sound was amplified into an echo that whispered lies and promises of torment. Every step reminded them that this was no ordinary battlefield. This was a place where reality itself had fractured, and nothing, not even the bolter in his hands, could guarantee survival. As they advanced, the horrors of the planet revealed themselves. Corpses, mutilated beyond recognition, littered the streets. Some frozen in poses of agony, others twitching with residual warp energy. Mutated creatures skittered from shadow to shadow, their forms grotesque parodies of human and animal anatomy, each movement unnervingly intelligent. Loric's visor caught glimpses of entities that should not exist, a humanoid shape with eyes where its mouth should have been, a shadow that split into a dozen screaming faces, a figure that melted into the walls and reformed just out of reach. The squad pressed forward, bolters firing in short, controlled bursts, the staccato rhythm punctuating the low hum of warp distortion. Even as rounds tore through flesh and bone, the creatures seemed endless, their numbers multiplying as if feeding on the terror of the living. Warp energy pulsed through the air like a living current, bending light and sound, making it difficult to discern reality from illusion. Loric felt it pressing against his mind, whispering promises of power and survival in exchange for obedience to something far darker than the Emperor. Some of his squad mates faltered, their eyes glazing over as the psychic resonance infiltrated the neural implants forced upon them during augmentation. One by one, he saw them twitch, mutter in voices not their own, and then collapse, convulsing as the warp reached in. Loric's training and conditioning screamed at him to maintain focus, to kill what needed killing, yet the visions threatened to undo him. The screams of the possessed and the cries of the dying intertwined, creating a symphony of horror that tested the limits of any mortal mind. Amid the chaos, Loric witnessed the first real corruption of a fellow Space Marine. Brother Merrick, once steadfast and disciplined, began to warp before his eyes. His armor seemed to twist unnaturally around his body, veins of black energy crawling over his flesh like molten ink. Merrick's eyes were wide, terrified, yet filled with a strange, otherworldly intelligence. In a voice that was both his and not his own, he shouted warnings of things to come, then lunged at the nearest ally with superhuman strength. Loric had no choice but to engage him, bolter firing repeatedly, each shot tearing chunks of mutated flesh from his friend. Yet even as Merrick fell, the feeling remained that this was not the end, that the corruption would continue to spread, seeding doubt, fear, and madness in the hearts of all who survived. The streets became labyrinthine, each turn revealing new horrors, pools of acid that hissed and formed shapes, screaming faces embedded in walls, and creatures that mimicked the forms of dead comrades, laughing in warped mockery. Loric's mind fought against the creeping terror, but the psychic strain was relentless. Every shadow seemed alive, and every distant sound suggested ambushes that never materialized, or perhaps existed just beyond perception. The bolter in his hands felt impossibly heavy, yet it was all he had to keep the nightmare at bay. He could feel the weight of countless deaths pressing on him, not only those he had inflicted, but the innocent lives consumed in the unfolding chaos. Each step forward was both a necessity and a torment, a march deeper into a horror that had no clear end. In a ruined cathedral at the heart of the city, the squad encountered the source of the warp disturbances, a daemon of grotesque proportions, its body a swirling amalgam of flesh, shadow, and fire. The very air vibrated with its psychic presence, inducing nausea, vertigo, and despair. The creature's voice was not sound, but thought, invading Loric's mind directly, whispering secrets, fears, and the futility of resistance. The squad fought desperately, bolter fire and chains words striking at an enemy that seemed to absorb pain and multiply terror. Loric's hands were steady, but his mind screamed against the invasive whispers, each strike a battle against both flesh and psyche. The daemon's form shifted constantly, impossible to target, and yet the Emperor's will demanded persistence. This was not glory, it was survival, and only the strongest, mentally and physically, could endure. By the time the daemon was felled, or perhaps banished temporarily, the cost was staggering. Half the squad lay dead, or beyond recognition, and the survivors were marked by psychic scars that would never heal. Loric's armor was scorched, dented, and streaked with blood not entirely his own. The psychic echoes of the creature lingered, gnawing at his thoughts, leaving impressions of horrors too vast and terrible to fully comprehend. He realized then that the Imperium demanded not just obedience, but a sacrifice of mind, body, and soul. Even victory was hollow, a fleeting respite before the next trial. In this place, the untold horrors of being a space marine were laid bare. Relentless combat, psychic torment, and the constant brush with madness that no armor or training could entirely shield against. As Loric stood amidst the ruin, staring into the lingering darkness, he understood that survival came with a price far greater than death itself. The warp had left its mark not just on the city, but on his mind, twisting memories, warping perception, and leaving a lingering dread that would not fade. Every heartbeat reminded him of the fragility of sanity. Every breath carried the weight of countless horrors witnessed and endured. The squad had survived the battle, but the true trial had only begun. The Emperor demanded more, and the universe offered only despair. Loric gripped his bolter, knowing that each step forward was a step further into terror. Yet there was no other path. In the Imperium, the horror was eternal, and the life of a space marine was nothing more than a constant struggle against the darkness that sought to consume mind, body, and soul. The battlefield fell silent, but silence was no relief. It was a weight pressing on Loric's mind. Around him, the corpses of allies and enemies alike were strewn in grotesque patterns, the twisted remnants of war, frozen in moments of agony. The fires of the city cast flickering shadows across their forms. But even the light brought no comfort. He knelt among the wreckage, hands shaking beneath the armor that should have made him invulnerable, and felt the first pangs of something long denied: doubt. For decades, he had known only duty, obedience, and the cold logic of survival. Yet now, the enormity of what he had seen began to seep into his consciousness. The screams of the dead echoed inside him, indistinguishable from the whispers of the warp, and he realized that the Emperor's protection had limits, and that even the strongest could break under unrelenting horror. Memories he had buried decades ago clawed back to the surface. Faces of those taken from him during initiation, their screams still vivid, intermingled with the agony of comrades lost in the recent mission. Loric could see the twisted eyes of Brother Merrick as he succumbed to corruption, feel the visceral terror of initiates facing impossible trials, and hear the laughter of warp entities that had toyed with their minds. Even as he moved through the ruined streets, the emotional residue of every death haunted him, an unending chorus of guilt, fear, and sorrow. The mind of a space marine was trained to endure, yet the accumulation of horror pressed against the very edges of his sanity. Each breath felt heavy with the weight of lives taken, lives lost, and lives that might never be saved. Alone in a ruined cathedral, Loric's thoughts spiraled into darkness. The warp had left subtle imprints on his mind, fragments of visions that could not be dismissed. He saw fleeting images of entire worlds consumed by fire, civilians screaming as daemons tore through their homes, and soldiers he could not save, writhing in torment. The psychic echoes were relentless, pressing against neural implants designed to shield him from emotion. But no machine, no gene seed modification, could fully insulate him from the horror of awareness. Doubt crept in, gnawing at the foundations of obedience. He questioned the cost of service, the worth of sacrifice, and the cruel calculus of the Imperium that demanded humanity be surrendered in exchange for survival. Even duty felt hollow under the weight of such revelation. The faces of his fallen squad haunted him most vividly. He remembered their laughter before battle, the subtle camaraderie of warriors who had shared impossible horrors, yet remained human enough to care for one another. Now, those faces were frozen in terror, dismembered, or twisted into forms he scarcely recognized. Guilt gnawed relentlessly at Loric's psyche, whispering that he could have done more, that survival came at the expense of those who depended on him. The psychological strain manifested physically. Muscles twitched uncontrollably, heart raced in erratic pulses, and nausea burned in his stomach. For the first time in decades, the stoic facade he had cultivated cracked, revealing the fragile, tormented mind of a being caught between duty and self-doubt. The warp whispered to him then, subtle and insidious, promising relief from the burden of memory and duty if he surrendered even a fraction of his will. Loric felt the allure, a temptation to release the pain that no bolter, armor, or gene seed could shield him from. His mind recoiled instinctively, but the lure was persistent, taking shape in shadows that moved with unnatural intelligence and whispers that carried the cadence of dead voices. Every instinct screamed danger, yet the psychic pressure was unbearable, forcing him to confront horrors within himself. Fear, sorrow, and the fragments of humanity that still clung desperately to his consciousness. The battle was no longer external. It had become an internal struggle between survival, obedience, and the fragile remnants of his soul. In the emptiness of the ruined cathedral, he spoke aloud to no one, a desperate attempt to anchor himself. "I serve, I obey, I endure," he murmured, though the words felt hollow. The ritualized speech, taught in childhood and reinforced through centuries of conditioning, was meant to banish doubt. Yet even repetition could not erase the terror etched into his mind. Images of dying worlds, screaming innocents, and corrupted comrades flitted across his vision, invading even the corners of thought he thought secure. The line between memory, hallucination, and warp interference blurred until Loric could no longer trust his own perception. He was a soldier trained to resist fear, yet fear consumed him entirely, not as a reaction to an enemy, but as a profound awareness of the horrors his life demanded he embrace. As the hours passed, Loric's mind teetered on the edge of collapse. Every sound, the distant crack of falling masonry, the faint hum of warp energy, the echo of his own heartbeat, became a reminder of mortality he had been trained to ignore. The weight of responsibility, of survival at any cost, pressed upon him relentlessly, and he realized that the true horror of being a space marine was not the enemies faced on the battlefield. It was the constant confrontation with one's own fragility, the psychic and emotional toll of bearing witness to endless death, and the knowledge that even the Emperor could not absolve him of memory, guilt, or suffering. Lorik remained standing, bolter in hand, shattered in mind, but resolute in action, understanding that his struggle would never end. The emotional breaking point was not a moment. It was a state, eternal and unyielding. And to endure it was to embrace the full, untold horror of being a space marine. The ruins of the city offered no solace, only shadows, ruin, and the faint stench of burnt flesh. Lorik led the remnants of his squad through streets littered with debris, wary of the next unnatural threat. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the psychic strain pressing against their minds like a tangible weight. Then, unexpectedly, a message from command crackled through the Vox. Orders that contradicted the realities on the ground. Reports were incomplete. The transmission fragmented, yet the intent was unmistakable. Continue the mission at all costs, disregard civilian survival, and eliminate any resistance without hesitation. Something about the tone struck Lorik as different, colder, and more cruel than anything he had encountered. A whisper at the back of his mind told him this was no mistake. Someone or something was manipulating events from behind the scenes, and the familiar certainty of obedience now carried an undertone of danger far beyond the battlefield. The first sign of betrayal came swiftly. One of the surviving squads, dispatched from another sector to reinforce them, appeared not as allies, but as hunters. Lorik watched in disbelief as familiar armor markings advanced with intent not to aid, but to cull. Bolter fire erupted unexpectedly, cutting down the unprepared reinforcements and sending his squad into immediate chaos. Screams, once a known enemy tactic, now came from those who shared his banner. Lorik's mind raced, the carefully constructed training and conditioning screaming at him to obey. Yet instinct demanded resistance. The Emperor had taught that loyalty was absolute, yet now loyalty seemed to serve a cruel trick, one that forced friends to die at the hands of those they were meant to trust. Every movement, every command, became a gamble with life, sanity, and the unforgiving weight of duty. Amid the firefight, Lorik realized the enemy had anticipated their tactics, exploiting weaknesses known only to those within the chapter. The battlefield shifted unnaturally, structures collapsing in impossible ways, shadowed alleys leading to ambushes, and warp-touch distortions warping perception. Every corner threatened with death, yet the true horror was internal. The realization that the chain of command, once sacrosanct, was compromised. Orders were no longer tools of guidance, but instruments of manipulation. Brothers he had fought alongside for decades were now pawns, unwittingly carrying out directives that served hidden agendas. Lorik's heart pounded, but no fear reached the surface, only the cold, calculating awareness that obedience could now be lethal. The truth was inescapable. The Imperium's machinery was indifferent, and sometimes it was cruel beyond comprehension. Lorik pressed onward, eyes flicking to every shadow, every ruined building. He could feel the warp bleeding into reality more strongly here, distorting the very air. Hallucinations of comrades he thought dead appeared, their faces twisted in silent screams, sometimes pointing to threats that did not exist, or perhaps threats that did. The psychic pressure was relentless, whispering temptations of surrender and promises of forbidden knowledge. Even the most disciplined Marine could feel doubt creeping in. But Lorik knew the truth. Yielding to the warp's lure was death, yet ignoring it meant walking a path of isolation, horror, and endless suspicion. Trust was now a liability, every order a potential death sentence, and every face a question, friend or agent of betrayal. The weight of choice pressed on him like the gravitic pull of a collapsing star. In the heart of a collapsed citadel, the midpoint revelation struck fully. Lorik uncovered evidence of a hidden operation orchestrated by the Inquisition itself. A purge disguised as reinforcement, targeting Marines deemed expendable or compromised. Orders that seemed routine now reeked of premeditated cruelty. His squadmates, unknowingly, had been set against him, their survival contingent not on loyalty, but on playing roles in a theater of death. Rage, confusion, and sorrow collided inside him, emotions suppressed for centuries breaking through like lava. The Emperor's mandate, once absolute and comforting, now felt like a noose, the weight of service bending into something sinister. Survival was no longer enough. Understanding the treachery became a matter of life and death, a puzzle of allegiance, and a test of endurance that strained both body and mind. As Lorik confronted the betrayal, the warp responded violently. Distortions intensified, shadows twisted into grotesque mockeries of his squad, and whispers promised vengeance if he surrendered his will. The streets seemed alive, groaning under the psychic strain, buildings twisting impossibly, and the cries of the dead mingling with the laughter of daemons that mocked every act of defiance. Lorik's training kicked in, yet his heart, so long numbed by gene seed conditioning, felt each loss, each deception, and each echo of manipulated obedience like fire through steel. Every decision required precision, yet precision no longer guaranteed survival. The battlefield had become a crucible not of skill, but of judgment, forcing him to weigh loyalty, morality, and instinct against the machinery of an Imperium that now seemed as alien as the enemies he had faced. The full magnitude of the twist became clear as Lorik reached the central war chamber of the Citadel. Data logs, partially corrupted, revealed that the Emperor's servants considered some of his squad dispensable, expendable cogs in a larger strategy of control. Every mission, every sacrifice was carefully calculated to maintain the broader agenda, indifferent to the suffering of the individual. His comrades' deaths, once tragic accidents of war, now carried the sharp sting of intentional cruelty. Rage burned through him, tempered only by training, as he realized that survival was no longer merely physical, but also a battle of perception, of understanding who commanded, who deceived, and how the horrors of the battlefield intertwined with political machinations beyond. Lorik emerged from the Citadel, physically unscathed but mentally fractured, carrying the knowledge that obedience could be a weapon against him, that loyalty could be manipulated to serve cruelty, and that the Imperium's true horror extended beyond the battlefield into every facet of existence. Trust was a dangerous luxury. Allies could be enemies, and even victory offered no reprieve from the weight of betrayal. The midpoint twist was not merely an obstacle, but a revelation. The horrors a Space Marine endured were not only external, but orchestrated, intimate, and psychological. Every step forward now demanded vigilance, not only against the warp and chaos, but against the very forces he had sworn to serve, reinforcing the brutal truth that in the Imperium, horror was both omnipresent and inexorable, and the life of a space marine was a constant test of mind, body, and soul. The city trembled as the warp surged violently, casting everything into a hellish twilight. Lorik and the remaining squad members advanced into the heart of the corruption, bolters ready, chainswords humming with anticipation. The air itself felt alive, thick and sticky with psychic energy, each breath a struggle against nausea and vertigo. Buildings twisted impossibly, their architecture defying logic, as corridors looped back on themselves and shadows grew teeth. Every step carried the unspoken promise of death, yet retreat was impossible. The mission, now a fight for survival, demanded they confront the source of the disturbance. Lorik could feel the minds of his comrades fraying under the strain, eyes wide with terror as whispers crawled along neural implants and clawed at the edges of perception. Reality was no longer safe. The first wave of daemons descended suddenly, bursting from walls and warped doorways with unnatural speed. Limbs stretched beyond human proportion, teeth sharpened into cruel arcs, and eyes glowed with intelligence that mocked their prey. Bolter fire tore through the closest attackers, but every kill seemed to spawn another, as if the warp itself fed on their fear. Lorik moved with brutal efficiency, every swing of his chainsword and every discharge of his bolter precise and lethal. Yet the true terror was not the creatures themselves, but the psychic onslaught that accompanied them. Their presence intruded directly upon his mind, whispering fears, taunting memories, and echoing the screams of those he had failed to save. Even the most disciplined warriors faltered, their conditioning strained against a horror that refused to remain external. As they pushed deeper, Lorik noticed his own thoughts fragmenting under pressure. Visions of home, fleeting and impossibly real, competed with hallucinations of fallen comrades and warped reflections of himself. He could see Merrick's face, twisted in rage and corruption, hear the voices of innocents he had slaughtered in obedience to orders, and feel the warp probing for weaknesses in mind and body. The battlefield became both real and unreal, a labyrinth of perception and illusion. Every action carried weight, every choice a moral calculus under impossible conditions. Bolter rounds became secondary to the need to maintain mental coherence. The horrors of the city were as much within him as outside, each kill a temporary reprieve from the psychic pressure clawing at his soul. The daemon overlord awaited at the citadel's apex, a creature that dwarfed any mortal understanding of size or malice. Its body was a constantly shifting amalgamation of sinew, fire, shadow, and screaming faces, each twisting and writhing independently. Its psychic presence crushed the mind like a vice, amplifying every fear, every doubt, and every memory of failure. Lorik felt the weight of decades of war press down on him, as the creature's gaze locked with his. Every nerve screamed to flee, yet training and duty compelled him forward. His squad was depleted. Only a handful of warriors remained, their armor battered and their resolve tested beyond endurance. Each step toward the daemon was both a physical and psychic struggle, a battle for survival and sanity, simultaneously. Combat erupted with terrifying intensity. The daemon lashed out, its limbs stretching impossibly, tearing through structures and warriors alike. Bolter fire and chainsword swings became a blur, each strike calculated yet desperate, each shot a plea for survival against an impossible enemy. Psychic interference caused hallucinations to overlay reality. Shadows became enemies, walls dripped with imagined blood, and the voices of the dead whispered accusations. Loric's hands moved with precision born of training, yet every strike carried emotional weight, the knowledge of those lost, of innocents slaughtered, and of comrades corrupted. Each kill brought temporary relief, but no comfort. The horror of the fight pressed inward, gnawing at memory, sanity, and identity simultaneously. At the zenith of the battle, the daemon unleashed a psychic scream that shattered the mental defenses of several remaining squad members. Loric felt his own mind fragment momentarily, memories and fears flooding in uncontrolled, but he anchored himself through sheer will. He could see the battlefield in fragments, allies slain, enemies multiplied, structures collapsing, and warp-touched horrors forming from the very air. Survival required both violence and cognition. Every swing of his chainsword and every discharge of his bolter had to be paired with mental focus to distinguish real threats from hallucination. The line between victory and death, between reality and warp-fueled illusion, blurred until only Loric's determination to endure remained intact. Finally, with a desperate combination of precision, brute strength, and sheer will, Loric and the remaining warriors struck a decisive blow. The daemon's body tore, shrieking in psychic agony as it began to dissipate, the air thick with warp residue and the cries of the damned. Yet victory was incomplete. The psychic backlash left scars on the minds of every survivor, visions of the dead and dying forever etched into memory. Loric's armor was scorched, dented, and drenched in blood, some his, some others. Even the structural collapse of the citadel failed to signify an end. It was merely the close of a single chapter in an unending cycle of horror. Each breath he drew carried the weight of survival, guilt, and the psychic residue of the daemon's wrath. As he stood amidst the ruin, Loric realized that the true horror of the Imperium extended far beyond battle. The daemon was defeated, yet the psychological scars, the memories of betrayal, the loss of comrades, and the endless exposure to warp influence remained. Every victory came at an irreducible cost, mind, body, and soul. He understood that survival was not triumph, but endurance, a temporary reprieve before the next mission demanded more sacrifice. The city, now eerily silent, except for distant echoes of warp energy, reflected his own fractured state, twisted, broken, and scarred by forces beyond comprehension. In that moment, Loric grasped the brutal truth. The climax of a space marine's life was not the defeat of enemies, but the constant confrontation with horror, betrayal, and the unending burden of obedience to an Imperium that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. The battlefield lay silent, a charred graveyard where warp-touched horrors and mortal warriors had clashed in a nightmare of blood and fire. Loric moved among the ruins, every step measured, every breath heavy with the psychic residue of the daemon's presence. His squad was reduced to a handful of survivors, their armor battered, their minds frayed, yet they persisted. The silence was deafening, broken only by the groan of twisted metal, and the faint crackle of lingering warp energy. Lorik felt the weight of everything that had transpired press down upon him. The betrayal of comrades, the dents he had caused, the psychic torment endured, and the realization that survival was no true victory. He was alive, but at what cost? Memories of the fallen haunted him in vivid flashes. Brother Merrick, twisted beyond recognition, and the other initiates, lost to both the mission and the warp. Faces of civilians glimpsed in psychic echoes, screaming as fire consumed them, blended with hallucinations of enemies long dead. The warp had left its mark, imprinting terror onto neurons in ways no armor or conditioning could fully erase. Lorik realized that each battle left a scar beyond flesh, one that no bolter, chainsword, or gene seed could repair. Survival demanded endurance, but the cost was the slow erosion of self, a fracturing of the mind that ensured no victory could ever feel complete. In the quiet aftermath, he was forced to confront the true horror of the Imperium, the unending cycle of violence, loss, and psychic torment that awaited all who bore the title of Space Marine. Yet amidst the devastation, a sense of grim determination took root. Lorik knew the mission had not been in vain. The daemon's influence had been purged, for now, and the immediate threat ended. But the experience had changed him irrevocably. His thoughts, once disciplined and singularly focused on duty, were now haunted by doubt, sorrow, and guilt. The emotional weight of every life taken, every ally lost, and every manipulated order pressed against his mind like an immovable stone. He felt both hollow and alive, a paradox shaped by centuries of augmentation and conditioning, yet vulnerable in ways the Emperor never intended. The realization was sobering. The true battles of a Space Marine were not only fought on the battlefield, but within the mind, against fear, doubt, and the haunting remnants of humanity. As he gazed over the ruined city, Lorik understood that his existence and that of all Space Marines was defined by sacrifice. Freedom, love, laughter, things long forgotten, were replaced by duty, survival, and unending vigilance. The Imperium demanded obedience beyond question, yet it offered no comfort, no acknowledgement of suffering endured or lives lost. He felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon him, the cumulative horror of every war fought, every daemon slain, and every soul lost to the Emperor's cause. This was the paradox of service, immense power paired with absolute vulnerability, purpose entwined with perpetual torment, and glory inseparable from suffering. Lorik could endure, but he could not forget. Finally, Lorik turned from the battlefield, leading the survivors toward the extraction point. Each step a reminder that the war never ended. The city behind him lay in ruins, scarred not only by fire and flesh, but by the lingering influence of the warp, a reflection of the impermanence of victory. He understood that the true cost of being a Space Marine was eternal. Survival, yes, but at the expense of memory, emotion, and the remnants of humanity. As the extraction vessel descended, its engines roaring through the psychic stillness, he felt a profound, terrifying clarity. The Imperium's horrors were not just external threats, not just daemons or traitors. The horror was embedded in duty itself, in the unending demand for obedience, sacrifice. As the extraction vessel pierced the smog-choked sky of the ruined city, Lorik gazed down at the devastation below, a silent witness to horrors that defied comprehension. The fires still burned in patches, casting long shadows that writhed like living things, and the echoes of screams, both real and psychic, haunted the corridors of his mind. Every step he had taken in this mission, every life extinguished, every daemon slain, had brought him closer to understanding the price of survival. Yet the cost was far more than blood or flesh. It was memory, identity, and the fragile fragments of humanity he had once possessed. The galaxy was indifferent to suffering, and the Imperium demanded obedience without mercy. Even now, as the engines hummed and the city receded into the distance, Lorik could feel the lingering presence of the warp, gnawing at the edges of perception and sanity. The silence of the ship was almost unbearable. It was not the peace of victory, but a vacuum of awareness, a momentary respite before the next mission pulled them back into chaos. Lorik's squadmates remained quiet, each lost in their own private torment, their expressions hidden behind battered helmets and haunted eyes. He understood that they carried invisible scars far deeper than any physical wound, the psychic imprint of death and horror etched into every neuron. In these quiet moments, the full weight of the Imperium's demands became evident. Loyalty meant survival, yet survival meant sacrifice at the cost of mind, body, and soul. Lorik's thoughts returned unbidden to the faces of the dead, friends, innocents, even enemies whose screams had lingered in the psychic haze. None of it would be forgotten. None of it would be absolved. As the vessel traversed the thin upper atmosphere, Lorik reflected on the nature of the Emperor's design. Space Marines were warriors beyond mortal comprehension, yet they were also instruments of unyielding cruelty, tools to enforce order across a galaxy steeped in chaos. Their victories were Pyrrhic, their obedience absolute, their humanity a fragile illusion layered beneath gene seed, armor, and conditioning. He realized that this life was not measured by triumph, but by endurance, by the ability to witness horrors and continue, to carry the memory of death and betrayal, and still lift a bolter against the next wave of daemons or traitors. The warp was patient, the enemies infinite, and the demands of service eternal. For a Space Marine, there could be no rest, no solace, no hope of reclaiming what was lost. The lingering psychic echoes of the daemon they had faced tormented Lorik even now. He felt its presence in fleeting flashes of vision, shadows that flickered at the edge of perception, whispers that curled around neural implants, and fleeting impressions of agony that belonged neither to friend nor foe. Each moment reminded him that survival was temporary, that the war was unending, and that the horrors they faced were not isolated events, but symptoms of a galaxy-wide rot. He understood that even this mission, though ostensibly a success, had only fed the endless cycle of suffering the Imperium demanded. There was no closure, no victory in the conventional sense, only the grim satisfaction of having endured, of having survived, and the knowledge that tomorrow would demand the same, if not more. Lorik's mind drifted to the nature of his comrades, the brothers who had survived alongside him. Even in silence, he could feel the invisible chains of trauma that bound them, memories of betrayal, the psychological scars of psychic assault, the guilt of surviving while others perished. They were warriors, yes, but each bore a shadow that no amount of training or gene seed augmentation could erase. The vessel moved through the sky like a specter, carrying them from one nightmare to the next, Yet even escape offered no true relief. In the hearts and minds of Space Marines, the battlefield never ended. The war continued within, as vivid and unrelenting as the chaos beyond the ship's hull. To endure was to bear witness, and to bear witness was to carry horror like a permanent companion. In these quiet moments, Lorick considered the essence of fear and duty. Mortals might tremble in the face of danger, but a Space Marine's terror was different, deeper, slower, more insidious. It was not a fear of death, but a fear of losing self, of seeing one's mind shattered by the warp, corrupted by betrayal, or crushed by the weight of impossible obligations. Every victory carried the latent threat of psychic corrosion. Every mission could twist the body, mind, and soul into forms unrecognizable, even to the one enduring it. Lorick had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to continue despite it. The ability to act when every instinct screamed surrender, and the knowledge that survival meant paying a toll that would never cease to accumulate. As the ship approached the edge of the planet's atmosphere, the horizon stretched endlessly, stars glimmering like distant beacons in a void filled with darkness. Lorick understood that this was the nature of his existence, an eternity of vigilance, brutality, and horror, with only fleeting reprieves. The universe did not reward courage or loyalty. It demanded endurance, and each act of obedience was both salvation and sentence. Memories of home, laughter, and simple human joys seemed impossibly distant, almost mythic in their unattainability. He carried them still, however, as faint echoes, reminders that something of humanity remained buried deep within, a fragile ember against the relentless darkness of duty and war. Finally, as the vessel ascended into the cold void of space, Lorick looked upon the receding world and felt the crushing weight of what it meant to survive as a Space Marine. Victory had been claimed, yet the battle had carved indelible scars into his mind, body, and soul. He understood the unending truth. The life of a Space Marine was not about glory, triumph, or honor. It was a relentless trial against external horrors and internal torment alike. An eternal confrontation with betrayal, death, and the ever-present warp. Every scar, every memory, every whisper of the dead, and every psychic echo would remain, haunting him as he carried the unending burden of service to the Emperor. The story did not end here, could it?